5 minutes changed everything. Behind a closed palace door, Prince Edward was handed a collection of files connected to Diana that had remained untouched for years. What he read did not produce anger at first. It produced silence. Then came a decision nobody in the room expected. Meghan's remaining private Sussex access would be withdrawn immediately. No delay, no negotiation. And when Edward finally placed the file back on the table, one name inside it had changed the entire atmosphere. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward looked back at the same page twice, but the words did not change. They did not. These were restricted family papers, meaning private documents kept under controlled access rather than public royal records, and their importance was personal. The files dealt with Diana's correspondence, her sons, and the limits she wanted placed around intimate material after her death. That mattered because one later access note seemed to stretch those limits beyond what the original instruction allowed. The prince removed his glasses and stayed silent. Then he pushed the folder away instead of passing it to the aide. Suspend the access now. The instruction was direct. Meghan's remaining access to private Sussex-linked archives, family channels, and restricted legacy material was to be frozen at once. Edward was not making a constitutional ruling. He was acting inside a family access arrangement, a private system controlling who could review sensitive papers. Still, he understood how personal the consequences would feel. Meghan heard the decision through a private call. At first, she thought somebody had misunderstood the order. Then, the explanation came again, more slowly. The restriction was already active. She went quiet. Her shock hardened, because there was nothing left to debate before the change took effect. She asked whether Harry had been warned. The answer gave her no comfort. Edward wanted the matter contained until the documents were reviewed. Edward returned to Diana's instruction again. A line concerning private correspondence connected to her sons appeared unusually specific, and beside it sat the later note that had expanded access. The difference was clear. What looked administrative now carried emotional weight. Had Meghan been given a privilege Diana never intended to travel beyond a tightly defined circle, Edward would not answer that yet. He closed the folder again and made one final request. William had to be told personally. The next pages concerned the future king more directly than anyone else. Edward's signature had triggered the crisis, but the real wound lay behind the names, and that was where the story now had to go. This was never simply about access to a room, an archive, or a collection of papers. For Edward, the files carried the weight of a sister-in-law whose death still echoes through the family. For William, they touched the memory of his mother. For Meghan, the restriction felt like another severed connection to the institution she once entered. And for Harry, the decision forced two parts of his life into direct collision. Edward had never wanted to become the man standing between memory and family. His role as custodian rested on trust, discretion, and the belief that private disputes should stay private. Meghan's remaining access was narrow, but it mattered because it offered a line into family-held historical material tied to Diana's legacy. An archive is a protected collection of records preserved for history, and this one carried emotions no ordinary file could contain. William heard the news alone with Edward. The prince did not argue. Instead, he placed Diana's handwritten page flat on the table, covered the lower half with one hand, and asked whether the handwriting had been authenticated. Edward answered without looking away that specialists had matched it against known samples. William swallowed, then asked him to read the final paragraph aloud because he could not bring himself to do it. Meghan spoke to Harry privately after the restriction became clear. She told him losing the access felt less like an administrative adjustment and more like being told her place in the family's memory could be erased. Harry tried to reassure her, but the words caught. His wife needed defending, yet his mother's own instructions were now at the center of the dispute. Meghan saw the hesitation, and that hesitation hurt almost as much as Edward's decision. Edward explained what made the papers so unsettling. Diana had separated material meant for history from material meant only for her sons. The distinction suggested that some boundaries had been designed to survive her death. William listened without interruption, but his expression changed when Edward added one detail. Harry's name appeared repeatedly throughout the files, yet not in the passage that triggered Meghan's suspension. Harry received that information in a documented private account prepared for the family review. The absence disturbed him more than accusation would have. Meghan asked whether that meant Diana had deliberately excluded future spouses. Harry could not answer. Edward could not answer either. William said they needed to trace how the access had been expanded. And when they did, the trail led backward to one quiet permission change years earlier. A decision almost nobody noticed at the time, but one that now looked like the exact point where everything began to break. Every royal rupture has a moment that seems insignificant until history turns around and points directly at it. In this story, that moment came during a family archive review at Windsor, when a temporary request connected to Harry was quietly broadened to include Meghan. There was no dramatic argument, no public announcement, no warning, just one altered permission entry. Years later, Diana's hidden instructions would make that tiny administrative change look dangerously consequential. Edward remembered the review because nothing about it had seemed explosive. Family archives hold private letters, photographs, records, and personal papers preserved under rules about who may see them. Those access protocols are simply the permissions controlling entry to sensitive material. Meghan's connection began narrowly, through a request attached to Harry, and after the couple stepped away from senior royal duties, that limited permission carried more emotional weight. Edward had noticed the change. He had also stayed quiet. Tensions around Harry were already raw, and challenging another family arrangement risked creating one more confrontation. Now that silence haunted him. He pulled the old authorization beside Diana's newly surfaced instruction, aligned the pages edge to edge, and stared at the difference before saying, "These were never meant to mean the same thing." The regret in his voice was unmistakable. Harry felt the meaning immediately. For him, the access had never been about privilege alone. It had become one of the few surviving bridges between Meghan and the mother she never met. He wanted his wife to understand Diana through more than headlines and memories retold by others. But now he was confronting the possibility that his mother had drawn a boundary he never knew existed. The trigger came from a private Windsor archive review held shortly after Harry and Meghan left senior royal duties. During that meeting, a handwritten authorization connected to Harry's file was re-entered electronically, with Meghan added under family access. The phrase sounded harmless, but it changed the reach of the permission. Edward had seen it. Harry relied on it. Meghan understood it as accepted. Years later, the rediscovered papers made that amendment look like the exact point where the boundary moved. Diana's instruction was sharper than anyone expected. Deeply personal correspondence, it said, should remain with her sons, and only those they personally designated, under strict conditions. Marriage alone did not automatically open that door. Edward now understood the old amendment may not have broken a formal rule. William saw something worse. It may have broken his mother's intention. That realization changed everything. The dispute could no longer stay buried in paperwork, because William, Harry, Meghan, and Edward were about to face one another with nowhere left to hide. When Meghan finally faces Edward, there are no cameras, no courtiers speaking for them, and no polished statement to hide behind. Harry sits beside her. William stands near the far end of the room. Edward carries only a thin copy of the archival authorization and Diana's instruction. What follows is not a shouting match. It is worse. Four people speaking carefully, because each understands that one careless sentence could turn a family fracture into something permanent. Meghan keeps her eyes on Edward as he explains the suspension. An archival authorization is simply written permission, allowing someone to access protected family records. Edward tells her the decision is not a verdict on her marriage or public role. It is meant to protect the meaning of Diana's private instructions until the family agrees on what those instructions require. William refuses to leave the discussion. The prince says the papers concern his mother, and he will not pretend the decision is distant or procedural. Harry answers immediately that Diana was his mother too. The tension sharpens. Meghan pushes her chair back several inches when Edward confirms the suspension is active. Harry reaches toward her arm, but she keeps looking at Edward. Was this decided before I walked in? The room feels suddenly smaller. Edward struggles before answering. He says the action was taken before the meeting because the access could not remain open while the dispute was unresolved. Meghan asks whether she was ever accepted as family if a connection to that family can disappear without her consent. Edward pauses, then tells her that belonging and entitlement are not always the same thing. The words land harder than anger would have. Harry turns toward William. He accuses his brother of treating their mother's memory as something only he can guard. William does not raise his voice. He says protecting a boundary is not the same as claiming ownership. Then Edward reads the passage everyone has been avoiding. Diana expected her sons, once grown, to decide jointly when intimate material could be shared beyond them. Harry goes still. Neither brother, Edward explains, can dismiss the other's objection. William then reveals something worse. He never approved the expanded access entry created years earlier. Harry had believed the permission carried family agreement. Now he understands it may have rested on assumption. Edward closes the copy but does not soften the decision. The suspension will remain until the family determines who has authority to interpret Diana's wishes. Meghan looks from Harry to William, then back to Edward. Her question has exposed the real battle. It is no longer whether Edward acted, but why he was the person capable of acting at all. Edward has spent much of his royal life away from the fiercest battles surrounding the crown. That is precisely why his intervention lands with such force. He is not the obvious combatant. He is not the brother most associated with confrontation. Yet in the Diana file dispute, his distance becomes his strength. The man least expected to choose a side suddenly becomes the person trusted to enforce the boundary no one else could touch. Edward knew that trust did not make the decision easier. His influence came from acting as a family intermediary, someone used to handling private legacy arrangements and archival protocol. Archival protocol simply means the rules governing how sensitive records are stored, reviewed, and shared. He was not exercising constitutional supremacy over Harry or Meghan. The family had also kept Charles away from the immediate ruling, fearing that his involvement would turn a painful archive dispute into another father versus son battle. Edward admitted his fear to Sophie in private. He told the trusted confidant that Harry might see the decision as betrayal from yet another uncle, and that possibility troubled him deeply. He hated being placed between a nephew's pain and the written wishes of a woman who could no longer explain herself. Sophie listened without interrupting. Then she reminded him that refusing to make a painful choice could become a choice of its own. The files made hesitation harder. Edward discovered that Diana had separated sentimental material from another category of papers she believed could damage relationships if circulated without proper context. The distinction mattered because one set preserved memory, while the other carried the power to reopen old wounds. He also learned that Meghan's suspended access had been broader than William understood. She could request review of certain catalogued references connected to Harry, though she did not possess Diana's private papers herself. Sophie stood beside Edward when the final confirmation notice was placed before him. A confirmation notice is simply the written record making an earlier decision official. He held the pen for several seconds before signing. Then he set it down, rubbed his thumb along the edge of the page, and said quietly that he wished Diana had been able to explain these boundaries herself. Sophie answered that no document could remove the grief underneath them. Edward signed because leaving the old arrangement untouched now felt more dangerous than changing it. Yet the signature solved nothing emotionally. It only made the restriction real. Somewhere beyond that room, Harry was about to discover that the decision reached further into his own life than he expected. Regret had become consequence, and he would be the first person forced to live with it. The first consequence is not a palace statement. It is a failed request. Harry attempts to retrieve the reference to a private Diana letter he remembers seeing years earlier. only to discover that the access pathway attached to his household has been frozen pending review. In that instant, the dispute stops being theoretical. Meghan watches his expression change. Edward's decision has reached across years of resentment and landed directly inside Harry's most guarded memories. Harry stares at the message longer than he expects. The restriction now separates his personal entitlement from the household permissions once linked to Meghan, forcing archivists to examine requests one by one. An archivist is simply a person responsible for preserving and controlling access to historical records. That distinction matters because Edward has not barred Harry from his mother's material. He has removed the automatic pathway that once connected the Sussex household to it. Harry closes the laptop and walks away without speaking. Anger arrives before reason. He tells Meghan that the new process makes him feel as though he needs permission to approach his own mother's memory. She understands the insult he feels, but she also knows one furious response could deepen everything. Meghan asks him not to answer immediately, even though she is still carrying the humiliation of being the person whose access was stripped. Meghan waits until the call with the archive team ends before saying what she has been holding back. She tells Harry she does not want him destroying another family relationship simply to defend her access. Harry looks at her in disbelief because the sacrifice cuts in both directions. She has lost a symbolic connection to Diana, while he now feels pushed into choosing between his wife and the family history that shaped him. Edward's instructions, however, contain one crucial limit. Harry learns through a documented family briefing that he can still review relevant material personally without Meghan being automatically attached to each request. The decision is narrower than he first believed. Then another note surfaces. Diana had written that her sons should never let disagreements over her memory destroy their bond. The words hit Harry with brutal irony. The files meant to preserve her voice now seem capable of dividing the two people she loved most. Harry does not issue a statement. He does not threaten a challenge. Instead, he asks for William alone. No aides, no lawyers, no spouses, no palace intermediaries. Meghan watches him make the request, and Edward is informed privately that the meeting must happen that evening. That night, Harry chooses not to fight the institution first. He chooses the brother standing on the other side of their mother's memory. For once, there is nobody else in the room. No Edward, no Meghan. No advisors waiting with carefully prepared language. William and Harry sit across from each other with Diana's instructions between them, and the battle suddenly looks smaller than the grief underneath it. Harry does not begin by demanding the restriction be reversed. William does not begin by defending it. Instead, one brother asks the other a question they should perhaps have asked years ago. What did Mum actually want from us? Harry had asked for this meeting because he understood something Edward could never solve for them. Edward could administer the restriction, but only the brothers could confront the wound beneath it. William had brought copies of the relevant pages, yet left the disputed administrative forms outside. Those forms were simply the paperwork recording who had permission to access protected material. He wanted this conversation to be about Diana, not palace procedure. Harry speaks first. He tells William that Meghan's connection to Diana mattered because she never had the chance to know his mother herself. He wanted his wife to understand the woman behind the public legend. Not through headlines, but through the private memories he carried. William hears him out. The prince does not dismiss the motive, but he says the access arrangement still crossed a line he never agreed to. William then admits what frightened him most. Discovering the broadened permission made him feel Diana's most intimate thoughts could slowly become institutional material rather than family memory. Harry listens without interrupting. For once, the argument is not about who suffered more. It is about what their mother expected them to protect together. Harry slides Diana's page toward William instead of keeping it on his side of the table. William looks at him, then moves his chair closer. Together they reread the crucial passage. The meaning shifts. Diana had not demanded permanent exclusion of spouses. She had demanded context, explicit agreement, and consent from both sons before intimate material was shared beyond them. Harry exhales, and says Meghan's previous access should not simply be restored automatically. William answers that the suspension cannot become a public punishment either. Neither brother has won. That is precisely why the moment matters. Harry knows Meghan may feel rejected, while William knows compromise will expose him to criticism from within family. Together, they draft a proposal for Edward. Diana's personal material will require joint approval, while neutral historical Sussex records can move through a separate access channel. The hurt remains, but the battle has changed. Soon, the outside world will learn enough to judge Edward's decision, and the brothers' fragile agreement will face a far louder test. By morning, a private argument over Diana's files has become a national royal drama. Commentators describe Meghan as shut out, Edward as unexpectedly ruthless, and William as the hidden force behind the move. Yet the loudest headlines miss what has already happened behind palace doors. Harry and William have reached a fragile agreement. Then one public moment outside Windsor shifts the mood from scandal toward something more complicated. Grief, boundaries, and the legacy of a mother both men still share. Edward watches the coverage with growing discomfort. Palace communications confirm only that private archival arrangements have been reviewed, refusing to publish Diana's personal language or turn her papers into ammunition. Palace communications simply means the official statements used to explain royal decisions to the public. That restraint matters because every missing detail creates space for louder interpretations, and the story splits almost immediately between exclusion and protection. Sophie notices what the headlines are doing to Edward. One calls him ruthless, another presents the decision as a victory. He folds the newspaper in half when he sees Diana pictured between young William and Harry, places it face down, and tells the trusted confidant that the woman at the center of this story never asked to become a weapon between her sons. Sophie answers that even responsible choices can look cruel when stripped of context. Meghan reads the coverage differently. The language about being shut out cuts deeply, and for several minutes she considers answering publicly. Harry asks her not to. He explains that his agreement with William changes the situation. He accepted a revised access structure rather than demanding the old arrangement be restored. Meghan remains wounded, but she decides silence will protect the compromise better than retaliation. Outside Windsor Castle, the argument suddenly acquires a human face. A small crowd gathers near the barriers, while one newspaper front page circulates beneath the headline, "Her words, their choice." The image shows Diana between young William and Harry. People stop to read instead of cheering or protesting. The mood shifts. What looked like another royal punishment begins to look like two sons struggling over how to protect their mother's private voice. Edward learns that journalists have confirmed Harry accepted the revised structure. William is no longer framed simply as the force behind Meghan's exclusion, and Harry is no longer presented only as the injured party. The temperature drops. Edward then calls one final private meeting. Sophie understands why. Meghan knows what it will decide. Harry and William know the compromise must now become permanent before another misunderstanding tears it apart. The headlines have delivered their verdict for a morning. Now the family must deliver one that will last. The final decision does not give anyone everything they wanted. Edward does not reverse the suspension. Meghan does not recover the automatic access she previously held. William does not gain sole control of Diana's private legacy, and Harry is not pushed outside it. Instead, the family adopts a rule built around the principle hidden in Diana's own files. Her most intimate words belong first to her sons, and anything beyond that boundary requires both of them to agree. Edward makes the arrangement formal. The old household-based access system is replaced with a two-tier structure, meaning neutral historical records can still move through ordinary review, while Diana's intimate correspondence requires joint approval from William and Harry. The distinction matters because it protects private family material without cutting Harry away from his mother. It also means Meghan's automatic Sussex-linked access does not return. The suspension becomes permanent in substance, but narrower and more precise than the original shock suggested. Meghan hears the final terms from Harry and does not fight them. She tells him she can accept a boundary rooted in Diana's expressed wishes, more easily than one presented as punishment. The hurt remains, but the feeling of being erased begins to loosen. Harry understands. He knows his wife has lost something symbolic, yet he also sees that the decision no longer demands he choose between protecting Meghan and respecting his mother's words. Edward speaks to Harry privately. He apologizes for the abrupt way the first suspension was enforced, but he does not apologize for protecting the material itself. Harry accepts that distinction. The anger between them does not vanish, but it stops controlling the conversation. William signs the new protocol first and passes the pen to Harry. A protocol is simply an agreed set of rules governing how something will be handled. Harry signs beneath him. Neither brother now holds unilateral power over Diana's most personal papers. Edward watches them, then closes the folder without ceremony. William asks for one letter to remain unread because Diana marked it for her sons alone. Harry agrees immediately. Meghan does not contest the choice. In that quiet agreement, the struggle finally reaches its true verdict. What began as Meghan losing access ends as something larger, a wounded family creating a boundary it should have established years earlier. Edward's intervention forced them to separate inclusion from entitlement, memory from ownership, and public legacy from private love. The door to automatic access remains closed, but Diana's memory is no longer being used as a weapon between her sons. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.